Hello, everyone, and welcome to BibleQuest.tv. This is the Tuesday edition, and we're stalling a little bit, waiting for Scott to come in. Scott's not here yet, but I will introduce Stephen. Stephen is with us. Hi, Stephen. How you doing?
Hey, Drew. How's it going, everybody?
Good to see you. Jeff Smeltzer from Exton. Jeff, you there? Jeff was there. I see his icon.
Okay, I am here now.
All right. I'll tell you, we've been just having some fun with the technical stuff just 5 minutes before the program start.
Yeah, well, I was late coming from another Bible study, and so I'm just squeezing in here under the wire.
That's quite all right. We're going to try to stall a little bit. Normally we don't stall, but we have to because the topic today. Well, first of all, let me take care of some housekeeping. If you're joining us in from the Zoom app from BibleQuest.tv, you can use the app. Click on the icon button if you want to call in using your computer, or use the Q&A box to text in your questions and comments, and we hope you will. And if you're coming in through Stephen's Facebook page.
Yep, if you're joining us through the Facebook page, as always, please just leave your comments and questions in the comment section below, and we will get to those as soon as we can. We appreciate all the questions we've gotten in recent weeks. It's a profitable thing when we can engage you guys and you can give us some things to think about. And even if your question is not on the topic we're currently discussing, feel free to leave it in the comments. We might leave it for a future show, but we love to hear from you guys and hope that we can all learn together from God's Word.
Oh, great. I'm saying great to what I'm seeing. I'm seeing Scott Smeltzer coming on board.
Chaos and computer problems here. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. I was just saying, everybody, fellow panelists and also people in the audience, we're just having a lot of fun 5 minutes before the program goes live with technical stuff and things getting going. But we're glad you're all here. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay.
That's quite all right. So I posted on the Facebook, the BibleQuest Facebook page. I bet you most people are not aware that, Scott, I got a reminder here to change your resolution because you're going to be sharing some screens, right?
Yes, I did. I changed it.
Okay, cool. But I'm sure most people, well, I wasn't aware of it, that Jesus, between 12 years old and 30 years old, he was actually living in India. And what I also didn't know was that he lived probably about 100 years old, and it was buried in Japan. Is that right, Scott?
Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ignore the Bible and you go to Shingo, Japan, you're going to find out he lived in Japan, went back to Palestine, where his brother was crucified, then went back to Japan. Or if you look at some other areas, I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. I'm not seeing my share screen. I'm just a mess today.
That's the way I felt a few minutes ago, so I'm glad it's your turn now.
Yeah. I have lost sight of all of you guys. Oh, there you are. All right. Hey there. I'm going to enlarge you. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to pull this up and apologize for the delay. And hopefully right about now we'll be working. Okay. Do you see a screen that has a whole bunch of books about Jesus living in India?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, I'm a total disaster today.
That's all right. We're going to start incorporating a comedy section here in a bit.
We can feature this episode in the outtakes reel.
Yeah.
At the end of the year, we can go back and do all of the
Except those are supposed to be funny, and this isn't particularly funny.
I'm hitting the share screen button, and it's just refusing to do it. Wait, maybe.
There we go.
We're getting there. I see something start. Here we go.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So after I've wasted 4 minutes, sorry, people. All right. So this is a topic I wasn't familiar to until recently when a friend of mine wrote a book, and he asked me to review it. And it claims that Jesus grew up in India. That from that he left Nazareth at age 13, and he traveled and he spent a number of years in India with Hindus and Buddhists, and then at age 29 went back to Palestine. So there's a movie out about it. Or a documentary. BBC did a thing on it. Here's a bunch of the books, and it all goes back to this character right here. This is Nicholas Notovich, who was 1 year old when Tischendorf.
Looks a lot older there, Scott.
Yes, he does look older. But when he was one, that's about the time that Constantine Tischendorf discovered Codex Sinaiticus.
Was he like emperor in Rome or something? Constantine Tischendorf?
No. Jeff, why don't you tell us who Tischendorf was?
Well, no, but he's a guy who made a great discovery at a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, where there were some monks who had preserved these ancient manuscripts, and one of them turns out to be what we now know as Codex Sinaiticus, which is a manuscript that has the Old Testament in Greek as well as the New Testament, and it's one of the oldest manuscripts that has basically the whole Bible, and it was written in about AD 350, or within a little over 300 years after Jesus' death, and so it's a very important ancient manuscript.
And that's not the guy on your screen. This is a Tischendorf wannabe.
Mm-hmm.
Tischendorf went to this remote monastery and procured an ancient manuscript for what government?
England or Russia?
Russians, for the Russian. It was
Russia.
Given to the Tsar, Alexander. Later, after the Soviets come to power, they're not interested in the biblical manuscript anymore, so they sell it to England. It's in the British Museum now. And to show you the value of an ancient manuscript that important, in the 1930s, it sold for about $500,000 when the Soviets sold it to England. So that is, I believe, who this guy on your screen wants to be. He's a Russian, and he's trying to duplicate Tischendorf, except he's going to make it up. So
he's going to find something, but what he's going to find is not real?
Yeah, he's going to find it. And so here we go. He's going to travel, and he did travel to India, apparently. There's a medical record of him being there for a toothache. And so in the year 1887, while he's in northern India, in the Arab Kashmir, he says that he went to one monastery, and the Lama was talking about this Isa, which is the Arabic word for Jesus. And he was the greatest of all their Dalai Lamas. And as he keeps talking about him, he realizes, so the story goes, that this is Jesus. And that he had been there. He tried to correct the Hindus on their idolatry. He studied under the Buddhists. He went back to Palestine, was crucified, and then some merchants that year from Jerusalem came to India and told about what had happened. And so he wants to see the manuscript, and he gets to another monastery, the Hemis Monastery up there in this Tibet. And he hears, yes, they've got this record, but they can't show up right then. They don't know where it is. So then later he's back, and finally after pleading, he gets them to show him the manuscripts. And he pulls down a couple of old manuscripts, and scattered here and there these references, and he compiles them. And the story, so it goes, is that Jesus from age 13 to 29 traveled east and was in India most of that time. You can go online and read his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. There's a whole bunch of stuff about his trip to India, and then he gives the text. So any questions so far, any comments so far?
Just the idea that this Notovich kind of was a Tischendorf wannabe. Tischendorf had made this great discovery or find of this ancient manuscript of the Bible. And the idea that Notovich was impressed with that and kind of wanted the same kind of reputation. What indications lead you to that conclusion? Are there things where Notovich talks about Tischendorf, or is it just the way he presented his information that helps you make that connection?
I haven't seen him mention Tischendorf, but he's very familiar with actually liberal theology of the time. So he's not a good Bible student, but he's familiar with liberal theology.
Okay.
And so known what was going on in academic circles. And he's Russian. That had been procured for the Russians. And the idea of going to a remote monastery, he picked a spot. The Himalayas in the late 1800s were one of the more remote places, on the continent. And so he's picking a place that's going to be hard kind of to get to. And now he's going to encourage people. He's going to say, hey, if you will do a scientific expedition and come down here and check it out, you can confirm it's true. Unfortunately for him, people did go down there and check it out. And so we'll see what happens after that. But here's one thing he says, because he contradicts the Bible in a number of ways. He says, the version I present to the public, one compiled 3 or 4 years after the death of Jesus, from accounts of eyewitnesses and contemporaries, has much more probability of being in conformity with truth than the Gospels, which he says are written later. Now, any book you read on this will often give a list of supposed witnesses or people cited as credentials or believing in it. They'll list a Supreme Court Justice, William Douglas, who is not a witness to it, but they claim that they say, one book says all of these people everybody that went and checked it out went away believing it was true. And then they'll cite these names. Elizabeth Caspary, connected with the Montessori school, which is quite famous. And a well-known Swami in 1922 says he saw the manuscript. We'll get to that in just a second. But first off, what this is one of several elusive Jesus was here documents of the 1800s and 1900s. So in the 1800s, who claimed that he found a manuscript written on gold that said Jesus was in the New World?
Joseph Smith.
Founder of the Mormons. Yeah.
Yeah. And every Book of Mormon has what right in the front part? The testimony of the
witnesses.
Yeah, who saw the golden plates. But do we get to see the golden plates?
No.
No, because the angel took them up to heaven. And so here, the manuscripts discovered by Notovich, no longer available. And here, a lot of people don't know about this. This is Christ's last will and testament from Shingo, Japan. This is from the museum brochure. Archaeologists from an international society for the research of ancient literature discovered the scripture in 1936. But unfortunately, they were discovered during World War II. So it only has a copy. But if you go to Shingo, Japan, the one thing in common, you can't see any of these now. These are the street signs in Shingo, Japan. The road signs will direct you right to the Tomb of Christ.
In Japan.
They claim, Japan, yeah. So Notovich's book claims Jesus's, youth was spent in India. In Shingo, Japan, they claim he spent his youth in Japan from 21 to 33. Then they say he went back to Palestine. And then his brother was crucified. And then
wait a minute.
He came back.
Whose brother was crucified?
Jesus's. They say Jesus wasn't crucified. They say his brother was. And listen, there's 10 to 20,000 people per year that visit this place, Shingo, Japan, to see the museum and the supposed tomb of Christ.
Oh, I misquoted you. I thought you said 30,000 when I posted. I thought 30. So you're saying 10 to 20,000 a year?
10 to 20,000 a year. Yeah.
That's still a good number.
Yeah. And so they say he went back there, he farmed rice, he died at the age of 106, and they had the ancient will and testament, but after World War II, they say, unfortunately, it disappeared. But we're told archaeologists looked at it. Well, they have a copy of it, and you can go in the museum, and there is their copy of the last will and testament. Well, now, I can't read Jeff, but go ahead, Jeff.
Well, all right. What is there to tell us this is the last will and testament of Jesus? I mean, did he sign it or anything?
Yes, he did. It is signed. It is signed, Jesus Christ, the Father of Christmas. So we can kind of
control yourself.
We can kind of dismiss this one. wanted to tell, besides the fact that Jesus didn't die on the cross, didn't rise from the dead, and spent all this time in Japan and signed his name, Father of Christmas, as if we needed more. Another telltale sign is this whole story did not exist before the 1930s or so.
So you're saying this is you're saying this is highly credible.
Not be true.
All right. Okay.
All right. Now, there's a lot of people taking this, though, more seriously. He was debunked thoroughly in the late 1800s.
Notovich was.
Yes.
The guy who found the evidence of Jesus going to India.
Yes, totally debunked. But a few years went by, people forgot about it, and then a Swami went to check it out, and the Lama, the chief Lama at the monastery, showed him the manuscript and translated it for him, and he confirmed it was true. So that got this going again. Just very briefly, let's notice this, the difference here. One thing is that with the Dead Sea Scrolls and at the top, with Codex Sinaiticus in the middle, and even with nonsense Gnostic writings like Nag Hammadi, we are dealing with ancient texts, and those texts can be seen and read. Sinaiticus and Codex Sinaiticus and the Dead Sea Scrolls can be viewed online. Jeff, do you have Codex Sinaiticus where you can pull that up and show us how that works?
Yeah, I'll share my screen real quickly here. I'm going to kill yours and share mine. Okay, so I'm actually going to share two different screens here sequentially. So first of all, what I'm sharing right now is a portion of the Codex Sinaiticus, a page of Codex Sinaiticus, and this is a page from the Gospel of Luke. This would be from starting up here. It's in Luke, the 18th chapter, and then I'm going to.
And this manuscript, Jeff, what's the date of this manuscript you're showing us?
About AD 350. In other words, 1660 years ago or so. And the thing about this is, what we're saying is these letters right here, this is a photograph of this manuscript, and these letters we are looking at were penned by the hand of a scribe some 1660 or so years ago. In AD 350, and we can look at his handwriting and what he wrote, and what that says right there is, and Jesus said to him, yet in you lacks, there is lacking, lacks, no, and then and yet, let me see here, and Jesus said to him, yet to you lacks something. All things whatsoever you have, sell and give to the poor. So this is the story of the rich man to whom Jesus speaks. We can read it. We can look at it. We're looking at something that was written in AD 350.
And this is not when Luke was composed. Luke was composed, I would say, in the early 60s, but it would have been copied, and then this copy was made from prior copies around 350 AD.
Yeah, around 350. I don't mean to say it's exactly that year, but yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's an example of a real manuscript, a valuable manuscript, and something that's historically valuable.
And that's the one that's the one Tischendorf found.
Right. And if in India there was an ancient manuscript, going way back then, and it really told of Jesus in India, can you imagine how much that would be worth?
A lot of money.
And so, well, why is nobody coming up with it? Well, because it doesn't exist. So let's continue here and look at a little bit more evidence. Oh, same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's Isaiah. This is a copy of Isaiah from about 150 years before Jesus is born. And you can zoom in on whichever text you want. There's Isaiah 53, verse 6, which is almost, there is more similarity between this text and the Masoretic text of 1,000 years later than there is between a King James Version and a New American Standard Version of Isaiah 53. It is just remarkably word for word.
So we're talking about authentic stuff here that was written way back. It's representations of the scriptures pinned a couple of thousand years ago.
Whereas with the scrolls supposedly that were there at the monastery of Hummus, this is a guy that used to be the director of tourism who seems to take it seriously. But he says for a long time, no one has been able to see the scrolls, despite several efforts. And another guy, the scrolls are no longer there. There's nothing, no scrolls. Going back to 1894, when it first came out, there were a Moravian missionary went to the monastery and saw that the story wasn't true. And he put a note to that in like the New York Post. In 1894, an Orientalist he was the editor, he would later be the editor of like all these Hindu, scriptures and everything. And remember, it was under British rule at the time. He just blasted it when it first came out because he knew if it wasn't real, if it had been, it would have been cataloged already. Notovich in his second edition, he replies and he says, well, the truth is indeed the verses I gave a translation in my book are probably not to be found in any kind of catalog because they're scattered through more than one book with no title. So that's why you can't find them. So remember, originally he said, hey, if you'd send a scientific expedition, you could find them. Mueller, who already knows about the writings of the Hindus and Buddhists and such, says there's no such thing. Then he thought, well, you wouldn't really be able to find it. It wouldn't be listed because it's all scattered about. And then he says, why does the Lama of Himmas refuse to answer, to vouch for him? Other people went and asked, and he says, well, they're suspicious, and I was able to find out because I knew how to do Eastern diplomacy. Well, then 1895, Professor Douglas, who was teaching in India, traveled up to Himmas, did an interview with the main Lama there, and he said, soon, mana mi dug, which is Tibetan for lies, 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 nothing but lies. So Notovich is just refuted. It was a hoax. And it kind of dies until 1922. 1922, this guy, who was a prolific author, he was head of the Vedanta Society in New York. And while in New York, he came across Notovich's old book and was intrigued by it. He traveled to Tibet when he got back to India. He went all the way up there to the Himmas. And he wanted to see if it's true. He made inquiries with the lamas and came to know it was true. He requested to be allowed to see the book. The lama took a manuscript from the shelf, showed it to the Swami. He got some portions of manuscript translated, and then he starts giving the text about Jesus in India. Okay, comments, questions so far?
He took only one manuscript out?
Yes.
But wasn't it go ahead. You're going to answer my question.
In Notovich's original story, he said the Lama took down 2 manuscripts yellowed with age. But then when pressed, there's no such thing. He said, well, actually, they're scattered among many different books with no name. And yet in 1922, a Lama does what?
He pulls out one volume and says, this is it.
And it's right there. He's got it right there. Yeah, so that's suspicious.
Here's a bunch of the looking suspicious.
Is this kind of like the Ark of the Covenants over there in Ethiopia?
Yeah, a little bit. Now, I think they showed the Swami something. I think they duped him, and we'll see why. They list other witnesses, but a lot of these are just people who said there's legends and rumors over here, but they don't claim to see the manuscript. Swami claimed to see the manuscript. That's kind of key.
Okay.
Go ahead.
That's this Abhedananda guy.
Yeah, Swami Abhedananda.
Okay.
He requested to be allowed to see the book. This is from his book. The Lama who was acting as their guide took a manuscript from the shelf, showed it to Swami. He said it was an exact translation of the original manuscript lying in the monastery of Lhasa. The original is in Pali. This is in Tibetan. It consists of 14 chapters, 224 couplets, and then he gets it translated. Okay? And that's this book right here, his book. Here's the thing. When he starts translating it, he has the exact same verse numbers in the section he's translating there as Notovich did. Here's the problem with that. Note, this is a manuscript with 14 chapters. The question is, are they reading from him an ancient manuscript, or are they reading to him from Notovich's book? Look what Notovich said. Yeah, here's what Notovich originally said. He brought me 2 big books, yellow with age. And this document is compiled of isolated verses, as placed very often, no connection, no relation to each other. The 2 manuscripts, they're disconnected, mingled with other accounts that bear no relation to it. I have arranged all the fragments concerning the life of Isa in chronological order and have taken pains to impress on them a character of unity in which they were absolutely lacking.
So if somebody shows something that has the same arrangement as what Notovich had, what they're showing is Notovich, not what Notovich purported to have gotten his stuff from.
And they didn't even need to show him Notovich. They just read Notovich. So the Swami couldn't read Tibetan. When you read his book, he has to have the Lama translate it for him. So it could have been an old manuscript of how to make tea, but they show him a manuscript and then they're reading to him from Notovich with Notovich's verse numbers, which according to Notovich, what he did wasn't in any one book. It was scattered, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and had absolutely no organization. He provided all the organization, and that's what they read the Swami.
What's the motivation here? Well,
a couple of things. He made a lot of money selling books in the 1800s. And he was probably trying to be famous, like Tischendorf. And there's a couple of other things when we look at internal evidence. He changes things to his point of view. He was Russian. He was from the Crimea. He was also Jewish. He exonerates the Jews from the death of Christ, and he takes away the resurrection and the miracles.
Isn't that the bottom line? One of the chief motivations of all of these so-called missing links or missing manuscripts is to discredit the truth in the Bible, or to sell a book or make profit.
Okay. And Joseph Smith, what was Smith's motivations? Did Smith really believe he found golden plates that told about Jesus in America? When you look at Joseph Smith's life, what seems to be his motive?
Monetary?
Yeah. He originally told one of his witnesses that he had a prophecy that somebody in Canada would buy the copyright. This is way back early on. And when nobody would, he said, well, some prophecies are from, and because they were puzzled, because he'd said in the name of the Lord, the copyright would be sold. He said, well, some prophecies are from the Lord, some are from man, and some are from the devil. But yeah, he was planning to make money, and he used it for power, and he also used it
ego. Ego seems to me.
Yes.
And I mean, that maybe that's a factor here too.
I suspect so, yes. Elizabeth Caspary, she was a student of Montessori, was involved in the Montessori school system. She says the monk showed her the manuscript. And there you've got a picture, and he's got something, but the next screen will help us understand what's going on here. This is a Buddhist monk. And I can't see his last name. Oh, yeah, Bhante Dhammika. Right? This is a Buddhist monk, and you can go to his website, and this kind of tells you the whole thing. In 1989, I stayed at Hemis as a guest of a senior monk there and had the good fortune to witness the famous Hemis festival. I asked my host about the Jesus story. He groaned, rolled his eyes upwards, told me that Westerners often come to the monastery and ask about Jesus. Some of the younger monks string them along for both fun and profit. Mainly for profit.
Wow.
Yeah, Scott.
Yes.
You could save us a lot of time. Why don't we just get to this right at the outset?
Well, I think there's a lesson here about document claims.
Yeah.
You can look at external evidence, internal evidence. Like internal evidence, just real quickly, just two things quick. look, it says here in his history, in his supposed life, the unknown life of Christ that came from these merchants in the first century. Here's some of the history of it gives. Pagans came to Israel from the land of Romulus, and he says that's Rome, and they defiled the temples, forced them to cease to worship their God, and demolished their temples. He's got his history all wrong. And so in the book, he has the Jews asking Jesus where they're to worship since their temple is destroyed, since their temples are destroyed. And then here you have the priests are adoring Christ. They're trying to get Pilate to let him go. They're saying he's a just man. And then when Pilate's determined to kill him, the priests walk out and wash their hands, saying, "We are innocent of the blood of this righteous man." So that's the chief priest saying that. And then, and another thing, he takes away the miracles, has no resurrection. And so just finally, there's this. Romans says he's declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection. Galatians says, if we or any angel from heaven preach to you a gospel contrary to the one which we preach to you, let him be accursed.
So we got a question from a viewer who says, do we have any extra biblical evidence from the 1st or 2nd century about Jesus from age 13 to 30? And the answer is no, we don't. And that's the thing. Where there is a vacuum of information, that's where people have the opportunity to let their imaginations run wild. And there is a mentality, there's a mindset that just craves going after the unknown and filling in the gaps.
Holly also gave a comment about does this guy care that he led people astray? And I would say not at that time.
No. Right, not at that time.
And there may be something to be said for the fact that in Mark chapter 6 and verse 3, when Jesus comes to Nazareth and is rejected there by his own family even, they say, this is his family speaking, but the people there say, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" That Jesus is referred to in that verse as a carpenter. And so it doesn't detail what Jesus was doing for the intervening time, but these are early documents, and they kind of presuppose that Jesus is working as a carpenter during those years in between, which is one reason they're so surprised when Jesus comes and is saying these crazy things. It's like, wait a minute, isn't this the carpenter? You know?
Yeah. Excellent point, Stephen. Excellent point. That and other passages where you have the people of Nazareth and the people of Galilee feeling like they have familiarity with who this guy Jesus is, and he's a nobody, but it indicates that he isn't somebody who's just shown up from India. He's somebody who's kind of grown up there, and they don't think he's much to look at.
And, when you think about, and there's been other attempts to fill in the gaps besides this Shingo Japan and the India thing, in the hundreds of years after Christ. Some of you have read the infancy gospels, which are nonsense. And those were attempts by people, say in the year 300, 400, whatever, to tell what Jesus was like as a little boy. And people talk about this great mystery. What about those missing years? The patriarchs, sometimes we have descriptions of their childhood, like we'd say Isaac or Joseph as a youth. But most characters in the Bible, do we really have descriptions of their youth?
The Apostle Paul.
Who are some major New
Peter?
Testament?
The Apostle Paul.
Yeah, what was Peter like as a kid?
Yeah.
Yeah, we know he was trained by Gamaliel, but beyond that?
Actually, no, Libby and I were in Belize, and in Belize, there is this ancient Mayan temple, and they have records there of Peter as a 9-year-old. Hey, prove it's wrong. Prove it's false.
Cassandra brought up a very good point. She says that the big lesson here is that each person is responsible to study with logic and sense in seeking the truth, is if that's what you want, the truth.
Yeah. And we had a couple of other comments come in that this is just a very strange thing overall, and that Trying to examine different theories like this is helpful as more and more people are buying into internet-based conspiracy theories. It really is remarkable how many, if there's some gap in information or perceived gap in information, everybody's clamoring to get their story to be the next clickbait, the next big thing, which if what you're saying is right, Scott, that may have been what Notovich was going for initially. That was before the internet, but
if he wanted to be clickbait,
if he can fill in the gaps, that's going to be what sells.
Is that puts so much emphasis on Paul's statement that if I think it was Paul that said it, that if you don't love the truth, God's going to send you a what?
A strong delusion. Which
means I'll believe a lie. If I don't love the truth, I'm going to believe the lie. So to Cassandra's point is, if you love the truth, then you're going to use logic and reason to seek it out and check it out.
Yeah. With all these different conspiracy theories going around and, just different, each idea wilder than the next. Sometimes I think about, I forget if it was Abimelech or whatever, when David feigns madness before him and says, "Do I lack madmen that you bring this guy in here?" But sometimes the internet feels like that. But yeah, this is a pretty, I had never heard this, Scott, before you started doing your research on this. But it's something that
my friend wrote this book, and he asked me to look at it. So I looked at it, and we're studying it together. We've gone over one time, and he's beginning to see some of the evidence, but we only had a limited time, and so we're going to pick up on it here in a couple weeks and get back to it.
Sounds like the original Russian collusion to me.
Yes. Yes, there was some Russian collusion going on here for sure.
Okay. All right. Just to wrap this up, go back to this real quick, just because tidy this up. So I stumbled over this, but what this says is, not that anybody cares. And the Jesus, that's not unusual, said to him, "Yet one thing," that right there I was not catching, "one thing to you lacks." And then right here, "all things whatsoever you have." So whatsoever you have, Poland, so sell and give to the poor. All right, I just had to clean that up. Okay.
So Jeff, let me ask you a question. When you're reading that, are you're reading it in Greek and translating it into English at the same time in your mind?
Yeah, not very well, but yes. And this is the thing about when you're looking at these manuscripts, there are no spaces between the words as you see here. It's so it's kind of hard, and a lot of times there's abbreviations. Jesus is just 2 letters here abbreviated, and then they'll do things like right here. They'll draw a line at the end of a line, and it's not normally how you write the letter nu or in, but that's the way they would do it at the end of a line. So some of those things get pretty confusing.
You mean that's not an apostrophe or a comma I see over there?
Right here. There's some marks at the end of some of these lines, and I can't see this clearly enough to see what they are, but no, that represents the letter nu or in. And this mark here, I'm not sure what that is, but the word goes from here and then picks up down here.
So not only do they not use spaces, they don't have punctuation mark. Oh, they don't have what's that word?
Punctuation marks. They occasionally have some punctuation marks, but not regularly, and so you don't have a period to let you know you're at the end of a sentence.
Wow, that would be hard to read. I mean, we need spaces between our words.
Yeah, we do.
We've had a couple of questions come in. Cassandra also asked, can't the tense change meanings as well?
That's true in English, of course.
Yeah. Dana comments on this. This reminds me of how Jesus taught us to be critical thinkers. When he says things like, "The blind shall lead the blind, and they both shall fall into the ditch." We should not so easily believe what someone says. They were believing they're well-respected religious leaders. Jesus taught us to be careful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the Bereans, they didn't even want to give Paul, they didn't trust Paul exactly, right? I mean, they had to go back to the scriptures to confirm what he had said. So they even tested Paul.
Yeah, that's right. And Tim also asked, do you know how old the manuscript is from Japan? And Scott, I'm not sure if you have a comment on that.
Well, it's since World War II.
Since World War II.
Well, that's when it went missing. That's when it went missing, right?
That's the thing. When they Joseph Smith, it's like asking what was the age of the golden plates that Joseph Smith dug up. That's assuming that or what was the age of the manuscript that Notovich found in the monastery? He didn't find one. The monk, the Lama in the 1800s said lies, lies, nothing but lies. In 1922, a Lama decided to take advantage of the situation and say, "Oh yes, here you go." But was there any manuscript in Japan? It seems to be just a tourist trap.
Well,
Christmas is a big deal.
I'm sorry, I'm bumping over you with the delay here. I'm sorry.
That's right.
The thing in Japan, that's not a shrine or something set up to give honor to Jesus, right?
In a way, but not as that he's the Christ, that he rose from the dead and you should be a Christian. No, I think by worldly standards, I think they said there's one Christian in town, but they've got a tourist industry. They have two tombs there. One is the tomb of Jesus, and one of it is the tomb of his brother, where his brother's ear is buried, because they say his brother took his place on the cross, and Jesus took his ear after he was dead, brought his ear back to Japan, and so here's where Jesus is buried, and here's where his brother's ear is buried, and here's the museum, and you can pay some yen.
So that place in Japan is kind of like my house. The house Libby and I live in is built in 2007, but we get a lot of tourists in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and it would be kind of like if I got some road signs, some very well-done road signs, and posted them at the intersection near our house and pointed the way. Washington slept in the house, fifth house on the left, and then go down there and have various things put in there supposedly from Washington's life. And we'd have tourists coming through this house built in 2007.
There you go.
Saying, I went to the house where Washington slept.
There you go. There you go. And you now have some supplemental income.
Yes.
Scott, I have a question for you. You had mentioned someone had said that in the theory that Jesus went to India to teach them that idolatry or something was not right. What was it that?
In Notovich's book, so what he does, first he gives a lot of his travel details, and then he gets to the thing, and it's a very short text. The Unrolled Life of Christ is not very long. It gives some false history of the Jews, like, for instance, the Israelites were taken captive by the Egyptians and brought down in bondage. So it messes up Old Testament history too. Very briefly touches that. Then it gets to the other things, and the detail you just mentioned was, what was it?
About Jesus teaching the error of the people.
Yeah. So then Jesus at age 13, the book goes to say that Jesus at age 13, well, in Notovich presupposes and describes too, that he thinks a lot of fellas would have been wanting Jesus for a son-in-law, because he makes a big deal. This is like the last descendant of David. I think Jerusalem would have had a number of descendants of David. But so everybody wants their daughter to marry Jesus. Jesus doesn't want to get married, so he goes away to India. First, he spends 6 years with the Hindus. It takes him a while to get there, of course. And he spends 6 years with the Hindus, and he tries to teach them against idolatry and tries to get them not to treat the untouchables badly. Then he goes up and he spends 6 years with the Buddhists, and he seems to learn from the Buddhists. But he doesn't do any miracles, and he advises people not to listen to miracle workers. Nobody's working any miracles. So he comes, it says Jesus is the Christ, but he takes away the supernatural. Back in the Red Sea, he takes away the supernatural. He said the Israelites went above the sea, and the Egyptians tried to scoot across the edge at low tide, and then it came in. So he tries to take away the supernatural. He's got its various agendas.
So I have to confess, I did not think we could spend an interesting 45 minutes talking about this, but we're out of time, and it was interesting.
It was.
Well, the first 4 minutes were a waste of time, and that was my fault, and I apologize, everybody. I tell you what, I want to mention this. This is something interesting. We showed a while ago the Isaiah scroll from before the time of Christ. Now, when the King James Bible was done, really most of our translations were done. When a lot of our translations were done, they were based largely on the Leningrad Codex of about 1009 AD, a Masoretic Hebrew text. In the Dead Sea Scrolls was found the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it's from over 1,000 years before. And I want to just give you an example of how close the texts are. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls of before the time of Christ. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? One difference. Some manuscripts, one of the manuscript variants is on whom. It says, like a root out of dry ground. Let me drop down here. Surely he has borne our sufferings, carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken and struck down by God and afflicted. And some manuscripts have the word and, some don't. And that's over 1,000 years apart. And it's just, here's one slight difference, and I want to read this. They made his grave with the wicked and with rich people. And one manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls says, with the rich in his death. Yeah, a rich man. They made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his tomb. That's one of the readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is even more specific than the Masoretic text 1,000 years later.
So the bottom line here is we have a lot of evidence that we can be confident on the documentation we have is what was written.
And there are the book of Jeremiah has more variations, significantly so and stuff, but just that Isaiah 53 is just remarkable.
Well, everybody, I think we better close it up. We're a little bit past our time. I want to thank you, Scott, for that fantastic, what do you want to call that, information that I too was not aware of it. Gentlemen, have a good week. Everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.